He stood at the threshold of the restaurant, unaware that his life was about to change. Stanley, the new waiter who had barely completed his training, was determined to make a good impression on his first VIP guest. But how he greeted this customer was something he would never forget. Stanley didn't know he was facing Keanu Reeves and had no idea that he could offend not just an actor, but the restaurant's owner himself. But how did it happen that Keanu was not only a famous face, but also a very determined person? Stanley had just started working at Le Paradis. He had dreams of a quick career rise, but the reality was harsher. Today he had the honor of serving a special guest. He didn't know it was Keanu Reeves, but he thought he was just another celebrity who would demand attention. Stanley stood by the door, nervously running through everything he knew about his first customer. He was the new waiter at the restaurant, just completed his training, but the first shift was always stressful. He adjusted his uniform carefully, but his heart wouldn't calm down. He hadn't encountered any celebrity customers yet. There were rumors that someone at the restaurant knew a celebrity, but he didn't know who they were. All he cared about was providing quick and professional service. When he approached the table, his eyes met the calm gaze of the man sitting in the corner of the room. The customer was wearing dark glasses and a black jacket, the image of a typical rich businessman. Stanley noticed the quiet whispers from the other guests. Apparently, his visitor was someone important, but who? Stanley didn't really pay much attention. He was already picturing the perfect service he needed to deliver. But little did he know, this customer was used to perfection long ago. "Good evening. How may I assist you?" Stanley said, pulling out the menu with its complicated pages. He placed it on the table and, unable to bear the silence, added, "We have some special dishes today. I can recommend something refined, or, if you prefer, something sweeter." The customer lifted his gaze but said nothing. Stanley felt a surge of nervousness, making his voice slightly sharp. He suggested a few dishes based on what he saw on the menu, but the customer didn't react. Stanley started doubting. Maybe he just wasn't interested. But he had to do something to break the silence. "I would recommend, well, fish with lemon and a bit of greenery, a very light dish, simple but elegant." Finally, the customer spoke, but his voice was even, almost expressionless. "Fish with lemon? Is that the only choice for someone with refined tastes?" Stanley instantly froze. He didn't understand what the guest meant, but assumed he was just ordering very specific food. He exhaled, trying to remain calm. "No, no, of course. We have other dishes as well." He waved his hand, but immediately noticed the customer glance his way. It was something strange, something that made Stanley feel a slight unease. Quick and clear, Stanley thought, trying to refocus himself. He was almost done with the order when, out of nowhere, he blurted out, "You seem to have quite high standards for your age." Stanley froze. The words flashed through his mind, and he tried to understand what he had just said, but couldn't quite grasp it. Why had he said that? The words sounded ridiculous, and he felt himself blush with embarrassment. The customer didn't move. He was still sitting with his head lowered, showing no emotion or change in his expression. Stanley didn't know what to do next and was sure his career as a waiter was over. But surprisingly, the customer didn't respond sharply. He didn't even move. He simply looked at him as if assessing him, and then said, "It's been a long time since anyone called me that." Stanley didn't know how to handle that. He didn't even know where that phrase had come from, but he could see that the guest wasn't particularly shocked. There was no anger in his eyes. Maybe he was just ignoring Stanley's foolish mistake. Meanwhile, Stanley kept feeling more and more nervous. He could feel the awkwardness of the moment stretching out, but fortunately the customer just nodded and calmly said, "All right, I'll bring something more suitable," he added, keeping his irritation in check. There was no trace of anger in his voice. Stanley, feeling a wave of relief, grabbed the order and hurried to the other waiter, still not fully understanding what had just happened. His colleague noticed how nervous the new guy was and came over, quietly saying, "You didn't get it, did you? That's Keanu Reeves." Stanley froze. Keanu Reeves? In the restaurant? Stanley quickly looked around but couldn't understand what was so special about the situation. The whole restaurant seemed to have shifted into some sort of mystery mode. He had a sense that something wasn't quite right. Stanley returned to the table and began to feel the tension in the air. Everyone seemed to know who this person was. He was more than just a guest. He was part of something bigger. But Stanley still didn't realize that by commenting on the customer's age and standards, he had offended the restaurant owner, who preferred to remain inconspicuous. And now, perhaps, he would be the first and last waiter to treat Keanu Reeves like that. Stanley was walking back to the table with the order, but his steps were unsure. Everything he had said to this customer now seemed foolish. He tried to remember how many mistakes he had made that day, but he immediately realized it wasn't just a mistake. It was a moment that could cost him his job. The customer sat there, still silent, his gaze never leaving Stanley, and it was that gaze that worried the waiter the most. "Why is he looking at me like that?" Stanley thought, sinking deeper into his thoughts. He could feel his heart pounding wildly. It was as if every step he took brought him closer to some inevitable, unknown danger. In the eyes of this man, there was not just a calm evaluation, but something more. An ordeal, a test that Stanley couldn't pass because he didn't know what kind of test it was. When Stanley returned with the dishes, the waitress working the floor shot him a quick glance and quietly said, "Do you know who that is?" His eyes widened in surprise and he felt his throat go dry. "Well, yeah," I said. "It's Keanu Reeves," she added with a light smile, as if to her it was completely normal. Stanley stopped, not knowing what to say. He couldn't believe his ears. Keanu Reeves? This man was in their restaurant? Was he the owner? Why hadn't he introduced himself? Stanley was growing more and more confused. Too much information had hit him all at once, and he couldn't process it. "Seriously? Are you kidding?" he mumbled, and his colleague simply nodded. He glanced once more at the customer at the table. Now that he knew who he was, it was as if he saw him in a new light. Keanu sat with the same calm smile, but something in his presence had changed. His silence wasn't just silence anymore. It was complete control of the situation. Stanley couldn't shake the thought that he hadn't just offended an actor, but the restaurant owner, the very person who might have hired him. How did this happen, he thought, walking back to the bar to take a moment to breathe. His heart was still racing and his hands were sweaty. Panic started to rise within him. What did I just say to him? That look, that question about his age. Oh God, I might have just lost my job. What the hell was I thinking, bringing up something like that? His brain was frantically searching for answers, but he couldn't find any logic in what had just happened. It all felt so absurd. Stanley knew that in situations like this he should apologize, but he didn't know how to approach it. And if this person was truly the restaurant owner, an apology might not be enough to save the situation. While Stanley stood at the bar, his thoughts overwhelmed him, and everything around him seemed to slow down. The walls of the restaurant began to feel too loud, as if every sound amplified the internal discord. He returned to the table, still unsure of what to do. The table was empty, and Stanley felt a brief sense of relief that his guest had left. But that was just a fleeting illusion. The stillness was too calm, and it made him feel like something was about to happen, something inevitable. And then he noticed one of the other waiters, standing by the window, quickly whispering to another, "Keanu never stays unnoticed." It was a simple phrase, but it immediately grabbed Stanley's attention. He felt the tension rise. Everything seemed to be in the shadows, and in the back of his mind the thought kept turning over that this evening could be the beginning of his end. When he finally approached the table, the customer was no longer sitting there. Stanley froze, scanning the room. Maybe he had already left. But no. His eyes immediately found the same man standing in the corner. He stood there with an utterly unreadable expression, but it was still Keanu Reeves. And now he didn't look like an ordinary businessman. He looked almost like an observer, someone who controlled everything around him. Stanley's mind shifted back into panic mode. He knew he had to apologize, but what if that just made things worse? What if I mess it up again? He thought. He stood a few meters away from Keanu, feeling his fingers tighten. But here's what surprised Stanley. Keanu didn't stand up, didn't head for the exit. He simply said, "You know, I appreciate people who aren't afraid to speak their mind, even if it's rude. But I'd like you to think before you say things like that next time." There was no threat in his voice, just a calm and friendly tone. Stanley was stunned. He hadn't expected such a reaction, and that only made it more confusing. I apologize," Stanley mumbled, but Keanu just nodded as if forgiving him. He stood up slowly and added, "Mistakes happen. The important thing is to learn from them. I think you understand what I mean." Stanley stood still, unable to grasp what had just occurred. He knew he had simply gotten lucky. But despite that, he couldn't shake the feeling of awkwardness. Keanu Reeves, the man he had encountered, was not just an ordinary businessman. He was something much bigger. And everything Stanley had said to him couldn't have been a simple misunderstanding. Stanley suddenly realized that his behavior could have cost him everything. He looked around. All the waiters in the restaurant seemed to be waiting for something important to happen at that moment. No one could say exactly what it was. But one thing was clear. Stanley had just come to the edge of his career, and he didn't know what would come next. When Stanley returned to the table with the new order, his heart was pounding heavily. He didn't know what to do or how to act. With each passing minute, the tension in his chest grew. His eyes kept unconsciously drifting over to the customer, but Keanu remained still, like a statue, with a slight smile that seemed almost unnatural. Everything around him seemed to slow down. The restaurant grew quieter. Maybe it was just in his head, but suddenly he felt as if there was a threat hanging in the air. Stanley felt his body stiffen with tension, and his breathing became shallow and rapid. He couldn't understand why this moment, this situation, felt so important. It was just an ordinary dinner, but for Stanley, it had become an epic test. Nervously rubbing his hands, Stanley placed the dishes on the table, but couldn't tear his gaze away from the man sitting before him. Had he been asking himself what would happen next, or was he simply waiting to see what would unfold? He didn't know. Stanley tried to regain his professionalism and smile. He even wanted to say something to ease the tension, but the words wouldn't come. Every attempt at a smile felt fake. What am I even thinking? His thoughts were tangled. He tried to recall what they taught him in waiter training. He knew he needed to be confident, calm, and delicate, but none of that was working for him. He had just said the dumbest phrase of his life. He didn't recognize himself. He had never been this unsure, even in the most challenging situations. But now, in this moment, he realized that his mistake wasn't just unpleasant. It was a mistake that couldn't be undone. In his head, his words replayed, "You have too high expectations for someone your age." Those words had struck like a blow, aimed not just at the person, but directly at the heart of his career. As if in slow motion, Stanley saw Keanu's eyes narrow slightly. He didn't say a word, but Stanley felt like his life was hanging by a thread. It was unbearably difficult to look at him, but even worse was that he couldn't understand what would happen next. He won't be offended, right? This is just a misunderstanding, right? These thoughts wouldn't leave Stanley. He searched for anything to calm himself. He glanced at his colleagues, hoping to find some support, but they were all busy, hardly noticing him. At one point, it seemed like every gaze in the restaurant was on him, but he couldn't tell if that was real or just his paranoia. He looked back at the table. Keanu hadn't moved, hadn't touched his order. It felt like time had slowed down. More questions swirled in Stanley's mind. He realized that his mistake wasn't just a verbal slip-up. It was a mistake that threatened not only his career but his sense of self. Stanley felt he had lost control, and this moment had become the most important one in his life. Stanley was ready for anything: harsh criticism, a retort, sarcasm, or even for Keanu to just stand up and walk away, leaving him in complete helplessness. But instead, Keanu said something that immediately made him freeze. "Do you always speak so honestly, or is this just a one-time thing?" The words didn't sound like a threat, but there was something in them that made Stanley feel like he was in a much deeper conflict than he had imagined. Keanu continued to look at him with a calm gaze, but now Stanley could feel his heart drop. He didn't even know what to say. Stanley tried to think quickly about what would be best to say, but time seemed to slow down. He couldn't come up with anything coherent. At one point, it seemed like everything around him had faded. All the conversations in the room stopped. The sound of his own breathing, now quick and shallow, filled the space. Stanley felt his fingers start to tremble. But then, suddenly, a voice came from the crowd. Someone from the restaurant staff shouted, "Keanu, hey, you're back. You promised to come again." Stanley turned around and noticed another man entering the dining area, a young guy in jeans and a t-shirt. He immediately walked toward Keanu's table and shook his hand. This was completely unexpected for Stanley. Keanu gave a slight smile and said, "That was an old acquaintance of mine. He's one of the people who helped me when I was starting out. Sometimes he just drops by to maintain old connections." Stanley felt his tension ease a little. However, what happened next made him feel even more awkward. The young man approached the table, noticing Stanley, and with mild surprise said, "Hey, you're the new waiter, right? I've seen you before. Everything all right? You look a little pale. Don't worry, everything will be fine." At that moment, Stanley felt a strange mix of relief and growing anxiety. Why had his mistake been forgotten so quickly? And who was Keanu, really? Stanley couldn't make sense of what was happening. The situation was becoming stranger and more ambiguous. After meeting his friend, Stanley felt the tension drop a little, but it was only temporary relief. Deep down, he knew that his mistake had left a mark. He couldn't just forget what he had said to the person who might have been the owner of the entire restaurant. Keanu's words echoed in his mind. "Do you always speak so honestly?" Stanley wasn't sure what the meaning behind those words was anymore. What exactly did Keanu expect from him? He still didn't know what to do. His intuition told him that this moment was far from over. Stanley couldn't shake the feeling that he had just become a part of a much more complicated game than he had ever imagined. In the following minutes, Stanley wasn't sure how to act. He returned to the table and watched Keanu, trying to gauge how he would react next. And then he noticed, as soon as Keanu stood up, the other guests started looking at him with surprise and respect. No one judged him. No one said a word. It was as if everyone instinctively sensed that he wasn't just another customer, but someone with immense influence. As Keanu made his way to the exit, he turned to Stanley and quietly said, "You'll make it if you pay attention. But I hope you're ready next time." These words felt like the final stroke. Stanley understood their meaning, but he didn't know how exactly they would change his life. Stanley couldn't shake the feeling that everything that had happened that day had become his personal tragedy. Keanu Reeves, the man who could destroy his career with a single gesture, was just a part of the puzzle Stanley couldn't solve yet. With every minute spent in the restaurant, he felt how every look and every step became a source of invisible pressure. He tried to work as usual, but his mind kept returning to that incident. He tried to find justifications for his behavior, but they never came. What did he mean when he said I could make it if I paid more attention? These words wouldn't leave Stanley's mind. He kept replaying the phrase over and over in his head, and with each repetition they seemed more and more significant. By the end of his shift, he realized that he could no longer just forget about it. He was starting to understand that his encounter with Keanu had not been accidental. It was a moment that would force him to fundamentally rethink his life priorities. Along the way, Stanley ran into Steve, one of the more experienced waiters. Steve was not just a colleague, but a sort of mentor to Stanley. He had been at the restaurant for several years and knew all the ins and outs of the job, including the political games that unfolded behind the scenes. Stanley saw Steve glance quickly at him as he returned with an empty tray, and he realized that Steve had noticed his nervousness. "Are you okay?" Steve asked, lowering his voice so no one else could hear. "Yeah, I'm fine," Stanley replied, but his voice was weak and unsure. "Listen, I saw how you were talking to that guy. Do you know who he is?" Stanley's heart skipped a beat. Did he notice too, he thought. "It's Keanu," Steve continued, not waiting for an answer. "He's the owner of the restaurant. Yeah, he doesn't like to advertise it, but you get it now, right?" Everything clicked into place. At that moment, Stanley realized that his mistake wasn't just a mistake. He had just insulted not just a guest, but the owner himself. In his mind, images flashed of him losing his job, getting fired on the spot. But instead, Keanu's words echoed, "You'll make it if you pay attention." It was those words that wouldn't let him go. Stanley understood that he was at a crossroads. If he acted correctly now, maybe he'd have a chance to make things right. But what did "pay attention" actually mean? He tried to decipher the meaning of those words, but his mind was filled with an overwhelming emptiness. Steve continued, unaware of Stanley's internal turmoil. "Keanu's a man with character. If he doesn't decide you're not worth his time, you could actually become part of the team. It's a chance, you know." But it seemed like Steve didn't know anything. Everything he said couldn't calm Stanley because he already knew. This wasn't just a chance, it was his last chance. He couldn't afford to lose it. Stanley decided he couldn't just go home and leave everything to fate. He needed to see Keanu. He couldn't just survive this moment without at least trying to rebuild some kind of connection with the person who could change his life. But how could he approach someone who was on the other side of the line? He knew there was an area in the restaurant he was never supposed to enter. The owner's office. He had heard about it, but he never thought the moment would come. Now this place became his only chance. Stanley knew the risk was high, but he couldn't remain inactive. His heart raced as he walked determinedly toward the back of the restaurant, where the door to the office was. There he was. Keanu. This was where everything would be decided. The door was slightly ajar, and without hesitating, Stanley pushed it open. He stepped into the room and saw Keanu standing by the window, staring into the darkness. Keanu didn't notice him enter, but when Stanley spoke his name, his face remained unreadable. "Do you want to talk?" Keanu asked without turning around. "Yes," Stanley said, feeling his voice tremble. I want to apologize. I know I made a mistake, but I'm ready to learn. I want to be better. Please give me a chance." The question hung in the air. Would Keanu listen to him? Would he give a second chance to a newcomer who didn't even know who he was talking to? Keanu slowly turned and looked at Stanley. His gaze was intense but not unkind. He tilted his head slightly as though studying him. "Are you ready to work?" he asked, seemingly not too harshly. "Yes, I'm ready. All I need is a chance," Stanley replied, feeling the pressure on his chest begin to ease. Keanu remained silent for a moment. The atmosphere in the room was heavy. Each of his words seemed measured but powerful. Finally, he spoke. "We all make mistakes. I hold no grudge. But you need to understand, in this business, it's not just your work that matters. It's how you carry yourself. You said something that could have ruined my reputation. But I'm giving you a chance. This will be your chance. Don't waste it." Stanley felt his body relax, but at the same time, he knew that this was just the beginning. It was a turning point, and if he didn't take advantage of this opportunity, he could lose everything. After the conversation, Stanley threw himself into his work with double the energy. He aimed not only to improve his job, but his life. He knew Keanu was watching him. Every step, every word now felt like part of a game that could either lead him to success or failure. But his internal struggles remained. He constantly asked himself, what did Keanu see in him? Why did he give him a second chance? Stanley couldn't answer that, but one thing he knew for sure. This wasn't just a mistake, it was an opportunity to change his fate. As Stanley immersed himself in his work, his colleagues began to notice the change in his behavior. He had become more confident, but they also saw how he started to ask himself questions, seeking answers with every step he took. His colleagues, seeing him, started to discuss what was happening. Some began to speculate that he had misunderstood everything, that in reality he was just a pawn in Keanu's hands. But others believed that Stanley truly deserved a second chance. One way or another, Stanley felt that this was more than just a job. It was his test, his chance not just to survive, but to prove to himself that he could be more than just a waiter. Stanley woke up the next morning with the feeling that his life had fundamentally changed. He felt uncertainty, but at the same time a compelling sense of responsibility. His last words with Keanu continued to echo in his mind. He promised himself that he wouldn't make the same mistake again. He knew that a task much greater than simply being a good waiter had been placed upon him. His career now depended on how he handled the next month. But what if he made another mistake? What if he couldn't live up to expectations? These thoughts burned him, but he couldn't allow himself to give up. This was the beginning of something bigger, and he had to be ready. At that moment, Stanley realized he needed to do more than just work. He had to become part of the team. He couldn't just be a pawn in the restaurant, but an important element. And the path to that wasn't straightforward. No matter how much Stanley tried to focus on work, his mind always returned to the moments when he had been unable to control the situation. Now he had to build relationships with his colleagues, but it wasn't going to be easy. He knew that they all had their own views on what had happened, and none of them would forget his mistake. Stanley couldn't understand what his future would look like within this team because he wasn't seen as an equal. To ease his anxiety, he decided to learn more about the other people in the restaurant, their lives, and how they ended up there. If he wanted to be part of this team, he needed to understand their motivations. One of these people was Steve. He was an experienced waiter, but his inner world was hidden from everyone. Steve often talked to colleagues, but his conversations were superficial. He avoided personal topics, and Stanley noticed that Steve didn't form close relationships with the others. Stanley decided to learn more. One day, as the shift was coming to an end, Stanley suggested to Steve that they go have dinner at a local cafe after work. Steve looked at him with some doubt, but in the end, he agreed. Over dinner, sitting at a table in a small cafe, Stanley started asking questions. "Steve, you've been here for a long time. Why are you so reserved?" Steve put down his fork and looked at Stanley, as if weighing his words. A shadow flickered in his eyes, as though he was considering whether it was worth revealing his secrets. "It's not as simple as you think," Steve said, looking Stanley in the eyes. "Keanu isn't just the owner. He runs this place with a special kind of ruthlessness. In his restaurant, mistakes aren't just mistakes. They're the end of your career. Everything may look nice on the surface, but you have no idea what goes on behind the scenes." Stanley felt a chill run down his spine as he realized just how complicated everything was. Keanu wasn't just the owner. He was a magnate, hiding his power, and his entire empire was built on unspoken rules that no one knew about. "What do you mean?" Stanley asked, trying to understand what Steve was hinting at. "I mean that if you make a mistake, it can affect not only your life but the lives of others. In this restaurant, no one can afford failure. It's all a game with rules that you can't see, Steve said, taking a sip of water and falling silent. Stanley was stunned. He hadn't expected to hear such words. He began to understand that he had entered a world where even the smallest mistakes could lead to catastrophic consequences. Soon after that conversation, Stanley was called into Keanu's office. He was nervous as he approached the door, but something unusual caught his attention. The door was slightly ajar, and inside he could see Keanu talking to a man he didn't recognize. When Stanley entered, Keanu nodded at him, inviting him to sit. But the man with him was a complete stranger. A tall man in a suit sat with a closed expression, and Stanley felt the tension in the air increase. "This is John," Keanu said, pointing to the man. "We're discussing an important matter." John didn't even look at Stanley as he continued to examine some papers. Keanu then focused his attention back on Stanley. "Stanley, I want you to understand something. Here, you're not just a waiter. You need to become the one who maintains the balance. It's not just about the food here, it's about the game." Stanley couldn't quite grasp what Keanu meant, but soon he realized that he shouldn't ask unnecessary questions. "You should have already taken the test," Keanu continued, not looking at him. "Tomorrow you'll be working with John. I hope you're ready for the real challenges." Stanley had no idea what this test was, but he could feel a growing fear inside. What if it was something he couldn't handle? He needed to prove he wasn't afraid, but inside he was torn by uncertainty. The next day became a real test for Stanley. From the moment he arrived, he could feel John's gaze on him, stern and silent. John didn't speak much, but every gesture and look seemed to carry hidden meaning. Stanley didn't know what to do, but he knew one thing for sure. If he didn't get it right, his career would be over. They worked together at the tables, and Stanley tried to follow John's instructions, but John only nodded, offering no concrete directions. At one point, when Stanley brought an order to the table, John stopped him and said, "You missed a mistake. You were supposed to serve the wine in a different order. What are you even doing?" Stanley felt his heart drop. John was strict, but there was something far harsher in his words than ordinary criticism. It was a threat. Stanley could feel the nervousness creeping back into his body. He began, but John interrupted him. "There's no place for I here. There's only room for the right actions," John said, his face remaining impassive. After Stanley made several small mistakes, John left him alone with the heavy feeling of guilt. Stanley sat in the back room, wondering what would happen next. He realized he had entered a game where making mistakes was deadly. He could lose everything: his job, his reputation, his trust. And now he had to make a decision. He recalled Keanu's words, "You'll make it if you're more careful." He knew that was the only way to survive in this system, attending to every detail, every gesture. Otherwise, his life in the restaurant would end the moment he made another mistake. When the shift ended, Stanley met with Keanu in his office again. He was ready for anything, but he didn't know how it would all end. Keanu looked at him calmly, as always. "You did well," he said, but there was something cold in his voice. "But you're still not ready." Stanley felt his heart skip several beats. Those words drove him to despair. "You still have a long way to go before you're ready for the real challenges. But this isn't the end. You'll work with us, but remember, every action you take could be decisive." Stanley understood. Now his life in the restaurant was not just a job. It was a game, and the stakes were much higher than he had imagined. The whole restaurant held its breath. Stanley was experiencing the moment when his dismissal seemed inevitable. However, Keanu didn't rush to punish him. Instead, he said, "You know, Stanley, I like it when people are honest. I'll keep you on probation for a couple more weeks, and if you do everything right, your life will change." Stanley couldn't believe his ears. 2 weeks later, Stanley became a part of the team at Le Paradis. His relationship with Keanu Reeves became more trusting, and he began to see that the man was far from the person he had imagined. But when Stanley decided to check the restaurant's documents, he discovered that this restaurant wasn't just Keanu's business. It was an entire network of restaurants managed through his personal companies.